This is not a story about death. It's a story about life. Now, I have never been lucky in life. Just the opposite, in fact. My life, I would say, has been fairly difficult. My family has never been wealthy. But that's like most of our friends and neighbors. We exist on the bottom class of society. We usually have enough to eat, and we're thankful for that. As a child, I suppose I was about as carefree as most children are. But it was when I was about old enough to begin to contribute to society that things began to get more difficult. We were a big family with little money, and so my job as a daughter was to be matched as best as I could, given that we had little in way of a dowry to offer a prospective match. Then my job was to be a wife and a mother. So as soon as anyone showed any interest, I was married off, and I left my family home to go live in my husband's home. Now, my new family wasn't wealthy either, and we all worked very hard to contribute as much as we could to the household. My husband was a good enough man, hardworking and kind enough to me. But my difficulties began when it became apparent after a couple years of marriage that I was not doing what most other women were able to do. I was not able to have any children. I tried to do as much as I could around the house. I tried to work extra hard on those things that I could do to make up for my lack in that other area. But I heard the whispers that stopped as soon as I walked into the room. I heard and saw the looks, and I felt the harsh sting of my mother-in-law's tongue. What kind of woman can't even get herself in the family way? She must not be very satisfactory as a wife. Doesn't she know how to fulfill a wife's duty? Doesn't she know that having a baby is worth more than baking a month's loaves of bread, or worth more than sweeping the floor 100 times? She spends so much time working. Why doesn't she pay attention to the most important thing? And it wasn't as if I wasn't paying enough attention to that most important thing. It was just that it didn't work. Even my husband got frustrated sometimes when another month passed and there was no announcement forthcoming that we were going to have a baby. Now, he wasn't very verbal, and he didn't say much about it, but I could see it in his look and feel it when we embraced. He was beginning to think that the marriage match that he had made was not very good for him, that it wasn't blessed by heaven. It was hard. But then the miraculous finally happened for me. Finally, when I'd just about given up hope of ever doing what was expected of me, ever being a full person, that event that we were all waiting for happened. And what joy! I was able to bear a son. At that point, I thought that that bad luck that had been visited upon me, the inexplicable anger of heaven had been lifted. I had a son. I was not useless. And I would have whatever I needed to live out the rest of my life. And finally, for the first time in years, the people in the household stopped judging me and stopped criticizing me. I had produced what was expected of me, and I was happy. The looks and the whispers did begin again when my son was maybe about 2 years old and there wasn't a brother or a sister to join him. But even that one son was enough to make it bearable. My son was the blessing from heaven that I had sought for so long. This became even more pronounced when my husband was injured while he was about his work. Again, I was the unlucky one. He came home and he took to his bed for a while, but he never fully recovered. And I buried my husband when my son was only 5 years old. It was devastating to be part of that funeral procession, to watch my husband as he was buried, and knowing that my life would never be the same again. But on that day, even as I cried, I remember hugging my son close to me, feeling even more thankful for him, that he had been given to me. Surely heaven didn't like me very much, but at least it had seen fit to give me this one consolation, this one gift. And so life went on for a while. And of course, I had to work even harder now that I didn't have a husband to produce and provide for me and my son. But we got by. and we had enough to eat, usually. And as my son grew, he did what he could. He worked a little bit so that the burden on me eased somewhat. And together, the two of us, we got by. And I knew that I would always have this place with my son, that he would be mine forever. The first day that he had to remain home because he had a fever, I didn't think that much of it. Of course, that happens. People get sick, they go to bed, they spend a few days there, they get up and they're fine. Only that didn't happen this time. My son was sick for a week and then 2 weeks. And then he wasn't ever getting any better, only worse. I used what little resources I had and I called a physician, but that did very little for him. The physician tried to pretend that he knew what was going on, that he could help my son, but he seemed to be about as much as a loss as I was. That's when despair began to creep in. I never said it at first. I was angry at myself for even thinking it. But it became more and more obvious to me that he was never going to get better. My one consolation, the one thing that I had been given from heaven, that one thing that reversed the curse of being unable to bear children like most women had, the one thing a woman is valued for, this one thing that had given me hope and a future after my husband was taken from me, this was about to be taken from me also. Of course, I pleaded with heaven not to do this thing, not to take this one gift that had been given to me. Surely I was not such a bad person as to have this one good thing in my life, my one hope, taken away. But heaven remained silent. I put a brave face on whenever I went to see my son, when I went in to wipe his brow, to cool his fever. But I became increasingly aware of the fact that I was going to be alone. And whenever I wasn't in his room looking after him, I cried. I cried all the time. I cried even as I went about my other work, because I didn't know how I was going to possibly survive when he was gone. And then, one night, he just slipped away. And any hope that I'd had for that miracle, any idea that maybe I was wrong and maybe he really would recover, this hope was gone. Once again, I was smited from above, not even knowing what I'd done to draw such curse from heaven. Now, much of what happened next is kind of a fog for me. I know that somehow things were organized, pallbearers were brought in, and my son was carried out of my house, lifeless, on that funeral bier, without even really comprehending or processing what was going on. I took my place at the head of that procession and began to gather people behind me as I went. As far as funerals go, in our town anyway, people stop whatever they're doing and they follow along with the procession. At least I had these traditions, the support of all those people following me along the way. But I was completely empty inside. And it wasn't just the pain of losing my only child. It was the certainty that life was never, ever going to go back to normal for me. I lost the one thing, the only thing that gave me a hope in the future. I would be forever destitute, forever dependent upon public charity, almsgiving to get through every day and every year. And the worst thing was that I would face this future without the only person who had ever brought me joy and peace since my husband had died. I was truly one of the unlucky ones. I was truly cursed from above. Now, those were all thoughts that passed through my head as my son lay dying. Now that he was dead, I tried to hold my head high and to lead that funeral procession for him to the place where I would see him laid in the ground once and for all. I couldn't help the tears which spilled from my eyes as I walked along. My life, as I knew it, was over. It was lying on the funeral pallet with my only son. I'm not sure when I became aware of the commotion among the crowd Our crowd was noisy enough as we walked around, solemn and weeping, the noise of a dozen people, crying, sniffling, shuffling along. But these sounds began to become mixed with the sounds of another crowd, an excited crowd, and they were following quite a different person. The first emotion that got past this numb sadness, that got through my weeping, was annoyance. This other crowd, instead of making way for us, almost seemed to collide with us. This is wrong. The one thing about a funeral procession is that you make way for it. The one thing that the grieving get is right of way. Why was this crowd not clearing out? Why could they not let us just pass by in peace so I could continue to grieve my loss? And that's when I noticed the man, the leader of the crowd, or at least the one they all seemed to be following. And at first I thought he was looking at my big group of people, but then I realized that he was actually looking right at me. And then, as if that were not upsetting enough, that he couldn't just leave me alone in my grief and insist that the crowd who were following him do so as well, he came up to me, he approached me. And leaning close, he looked right into my eyes, red-rimmed and constantly leaking tears, and he said, "Don't cry." Now I'm going to tell you that even though I'm a woman and he's a man, and it would have been totally improper, if I was not so overwhelmed with grief at that very moment, I would have given him a piece of my mind. Don't cry? Don't cry? How can I keep from crying when I'm one of the unlucky ones, when heaven hates me so much that it took not only my husband from me, but my one and only child? How am I supposed to stop crying? How am I supposed to ever stop crying and go on with my life? I wanted to shout this at him. I wanted to yell at him for his uncaring words, for his presumption that he could tell me what to do and how to feel. But exhaustion, sadness, tears, all these things put together, glued my tongue to the roof of my mouth, and I was unable to say anything at all. I just glared at him, and I hoped to convey all of those emotions with the daggers of my eyes. But as I glared at him, as we locked eyes, as I really looked into his gaze, I began to see that the eyes that looked back at me were not filled with mirth, or with indifference, or with a desire to mock my pain. I suddenly realized that his eyes, too, were filling with tears. He was looking at me with a broken heart. Far from disregarding my pain, he felt it too. Then he walked over to my son's funeral pallet. He stopped the pallbearers right in their tracks. And some of the crowd began to look at me confused. This was definitely not proper behavior at a funeral procession, no matter who you are. But having seen what I just saw when he looked at me, I only watched, waiting to see what this man was going to do. And to everyone's surprise, he touched the funeral bed on which my son was lying. He was making himself unclean according to our religious customs in the process. Dead bodies have to be dealt with, but only the closest relatives are expected to deal with them, are expected to touch them and take that uncleanliness upon themselves. I had no idea what this man was up to, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. And the entire procession stopped, wondering what was going on, what was going to happen next. And then he spoke that one word, even more absurd than the thing he'd said to me. Arise. That was it, arise. And we all stood there, the noisy crowd suddenly quiet, watching, waiting. Was I hoping for anything? I don't know what I was feeling at the time. I was totally taken aback that this man had noticed this one grieving widow and had responded to the pain in my life. I think I was curious, perhaps, maybe relieved, even just a little bit, that he cared so much that my own pain had broken the heart of a stranger. But I couldn't say that I was filled with hope, because I'll tell you, when my son, this one that I had watched as he succumbed to illness and slipped away in the night, the one that I had washed with my own hands and cried over, my only son sat up. He sat up and he began speaking. Speaking. This one who was dead was sitting up and talking. Now, I couldn't hear what he was saying because of all the uproar among the crowd at that instant. There were shouts of amazement and joy and of disbelief as well. Who was this man? Had he really just raised my son from the dead? It defies belief, and yet that's what my eyes were telling me. I saw the man lean over, and he listened to what my son was saying, and he answered a few words. And then he took my son, and he lifted him down from the funeral bed, and he walked him right over to me. He put my son's hand in mine, warm and alive, and my son squeezed my hand. Now, the entire crowd was chattering at this point. They couldn't believe what they'd seen either, but they had just seen the impossible. They'd seen a miracle. They'd seen someone who was dead raised to life. Now, I was so overwhelmed with emotion at that point, so filled with joy that my son was alive, that I was holding him once again, that I was no longer alone. I was also filled with wonder at this man. Who in the world has that kind of power to say to someone, arise, and they just do it? Who on this earth can defeat that most powerful force of death? Even as I hugged my son to me over and over, I couldn't resist looking at him, searching him out in the crowd, trying to get a glimpse of him as the crowd closed in around him. How could I ever repay him? What could I ever give him as thanks that he had done this thing for my son and for me? For in truth, he had not just given me back my son's life. He'd given me back my own life as well. By all rights, he could have taken my son's life in payment. He could have had my son as his bondservant. And I might have been satisfied even with that, because at least my son was alive and well and in the world. But he gave my son back to me. He refused even that most basic form of payment. He never did ask for anything in return for what he'd done. Although I would have given him anything. I would have given him everything. Now, the hard work in our lives has not stopped. My son and I both work to earn our keep. But we have each other. I have him, he has me. And one day, we hope to add to our household. My son will take a wife, and if all goes well, then I'll be able to hold my grandchildren upon my knee, and I'll be able to give them the love that is pent up in my heart from having only one son to spend it on. I never saw that man again. I have longed to. That day was such a muddle that I didn't even really get to say anything to him, to express to him all the joy and the thanks in my heart for all that he gave me that day. Not just the gift of raising my son, but the gift of seeing me in my grief, of coming over to me even when I didn't ask for his help. I didn't even know I could have asked for his help. And as I said, I never met him again. That day was kind of a blur, but one word lingered about this man. It went throughout the entire region. Many, including me, I have to say, was even just a little bit fearful. What kind of power had this man displayed? No one on earth is able to do what he did. They called him a prophet. And I think that he must have been, because there are stories about prophets in our scriptures, about one in particular who did raise a widow's son from the dead. But I think that he had to be more than a prophet as well. The other thing that they said about him was that he was God. God coming to help out his people. God is looking to the needs of his people, they said. God has visited his people. That's what the crowd said. The rumor that echoed for years after that day. God. Could this man have been God? I wouldn't doubt that for a second. In fact, I really believe it. I have no definite proof of this, other than looking over at my son across the table as he devours the meal that I put in front of him. Other than this son that I watched die, and now I watch him as he lives. But I do know one thing. I spent most of my life feeling like I was cursed from heaven. Like heaven and the God who was in it hated me and was out to get me for some reason that I didn't know. I may not be a perfect person, but I'm surely not worse than anyone else. First, there was our poverty, but of course everyone around us really is poor. But then there was my barrenness, something that is not true of most of the women around me. And then my husband's death, and then my son's. I thought that heaven had it in for me. But now God has visited his people. He visited me, of all people. This man walking the earth means that God is coming to help his people, that God is looking to the needs of his people. And because of this, my outlook on life is different. My life isn't necessarily easier, but it is different. Because I finally see that even though I've been through some rough things in life, God doesn't hate me. Indeed, he cares enough about me to look into my eyes with a broken heart and tell me not to cry. And then he does something about it. It makes life in this world easier to bear to know that God has come to his people, that he's looked at us in compassion, that he's touched us, that he cared about us. You know, I think of that man quite often. I think of him and I want him to know that we never forgot the life that he gave back to us that day. Well, lives, really, actually, not just my son's, but my own. My son is growing to be quite the person. He's the kind of person that everyone loves to be around because my son cares about people. We both work very hard to notice other people in their grief or their pain or even just the ups and downs of everyday life in a hard world. I remember how that man looked at me, and I try to look at other people in the same way, to notice them, even when the world tends to pass them by, to see the pain and the struggle in their lives. We don't have a lot of material things, but we try to welcome people into our home, to feed them, to listen to them, and provide for them whatever small thing that we can. I like to think that when we are doing those kinds of things for our friends and our neighbors and our acquaintances, that I'm doing it for that man. I guess in some ways I always hope that he'll show up and I can bless him in some small way. So those things that we do for others, I kind of think we're practicing doing it for him. And if and when I ever meet him again, I'll be able to give him something. As I said, the story is not about death, it is about life. A life which is raised from the grave. And both mine and my son's life are now lived in gratitude of that day when that man noticed me, noticed a widow in her grief, and told her not to cry, because he was going to do something miraculous. Would you join me in prayer? We pray to you today, O God, knowing and believing that you hear, you listen, you love, and you act. We know and believe that your Spirit stirs in our slumber and greets us each morning. We know and believe that you are present with us in our living and in our dying. We know and believe that your kingdom of peace and justice will reign forever. And we know and believe that we will all feast at your banquet and dance in your sunshine. We pray to you, O God, knowing and believing that you hear, you listen, you love, and you act. Thank you. Amen.